I didn't realize, I use these glasses for whenever I work on the computer. And I didn't know that they would help me with this, but they are. So I'm using them. Now I can see it. Praise the Lord. So just excuse the looks. We're going to be studying in 1 Samuel, so turn to 1 Samuel, the first chapter. I have enjoyed things in this book, 1 Samuel, for some time, and as I was praying about what to go into in our studies for this next semester of our ladies' meetings, this kept coming back to me, so I'm just taking it as from the Lord that this is what He wants us to learn more about. It has to do with concerning Israel, of course, and we know I just wanted to give us a few thoughts to bring us up to date in where the book of 1 Samuel starts. We all know there were 12 tribes of Israel. That was God's chosen nation to work His will and to be a witness to the rest of the world for Him. Israel started with the 12 tribes who were the 12 sons of Jacob. God had promised Abraham that He would make of him a great nation. And of course, that nation was Israel. Abraham and Isaac was Abraham's son, and then Jacob was Isaac's son. And from these three fathers, we're calling them fathers, the nation of Israel began. Jacob had 12 sons, and so they began with their 12 sons. We all know the story of Moses when Israel was in Egypt. Pardon me. And Moses was their leader. God called Moses and told him, I want you to take Israel out of Egypt, take them back to the land that I will give them. And so Moses was their first leader, their ruler, and Levi, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, was the priestly tribe. God separated them out as the priestly tribe to be the spiritual leaders of Israel. And of the priests, there was always one high priest who was the main leader, and the other priests were doing them what the leaders had them to do in leading the nation of Israel in their spiritual walk with the Lord. So Aaron was the first high priest, and then Aaron's sons followed him. We know that the first two that followed him, of his sons, was Nadab and Abihu. But did Nadab and Abihu continue as priests, the high priest, very long? No. Why didn't they?
They offer strange fire.
Yes, that God gave them certain directions on how to lead these people. He hasn't changed. He gives His leaders certain directions also on how to lead His people. And we need to be willing to obey those leaders that He puts over us. So, Nadab and Abihu, God killed them right off because they offered strange fire. Now, that strange fire just simply means it was fire that God didn't ordain. God would have caused the fire from Himself to burn those first offerings. But they didn't wait. Nadab and Abihu didn't wait for God to send the fire. They got their own fire somehow. I don't know just how they did, but they started burning with their own fire. God wouldn't allow that. So He caused them to be slain right away. You know, like I said, God hasn't changed. And when we don't obey God, He doesn't He slay us right away like He did then.
Grace.
His grace. Jesus' death on the cross paid for every one of our sins. And that's why he doesn't. It is because of his grace. But anyway, Nadab and Abihu were slain by God. And so they were followed by Eleazar and Ithamar. And I think Eleazar was really the leading one, the priest that was guiding the children of Israel. Then, after Moses died, who followed as the leader? Joshua was the leader. And God was still ruling, but he would rule through these men that he put in as leading them. God was really the leader of them. And that's what he wanted. As long as they obeyed God, he blessed them. When they didn't obey God, there was judgment that would come from the Lord. Then after Joshua died, there wasn't one man then that God put in as leader, but there were up to 13 judges he called his men that he had leading them, and after that judges, and he had 13 to lead them. But he was wanting the judges to obey him also, to lead according to what God ordained. But most of them were not looking. Most of these judges weren't looking to God for their instructions. They just did what they wanted to do, what they thought was right. Well, they got lots of problems because of that, because they didn't do the key verse, which shows the confusion in the condition of Israel during this time that the judges were ruling, was every man did what was right in their own eyes. That's in Judges 21:25. You can read that, where they were just doing what was right in their own eyes, and that brought all kinds of problems. So Samuel was the last judge, and he wanted his sons to follow him as judges, because that's the way it usually worked. The sons would take up the leadership after their fathers died. But the people rejected Samuel's sons from leading them because they were very wicked. They weren't spiritual at all. The other judges would listen to the Lord sometimes, some of them. But as a whole, the other judges did not follow God's instructions. And so when Samuel's sons were wicked from the beginning, they didn't want them to lead. They said, we want a king like the other nations. All the other nations around Israel at that time had kings over them. And so the ones of Israel decided, well, let's just do the way they do. That way maybe we won't have so many problems. We'll have a king to rule over us. Well, Samuel knew that that wasn't God's order. It was the people that wanted a king. God hadn't told him that. And so he knew that he shouldn't do that to give them a king. But they insisted. And so God told Samuel, he says, go ahead and give them a king. He says, but tell them all the problems they're going to have, because that king is going to take their crops, is going to take from them, to bring all kinds of problems, but they're asking for a king. So tell them what the problems it will bring, but then go ahead and give them a king. And of course, that's when he went ahead and who was their first king? Saul. Saul was the first king. Was he a good king? He wasn't a good king either. But God allowed him to be the kings, and then who was the one that God chose to be king? David. He chose David to be the king. And we'll read about that as we go on into the book of Samuel. But let's begin now with the first book of Samuel, because this is when Samuel had judged over them for quite a few years. But now is when they're asking for a king, when Samuel wasn't going to be ruling anymore. So let's read from verse 1 of chapter 1 of Samuel. Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim, Zophia, of Mount Ephraim. We can get of Mount Ephraim. And his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroboam, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zophah, the son of Elkanah was an Ephrathite. Ephrathite is another name for Bethlehem. And so he was from the vicinity of Bethlehem. But at this point in his life, he was ruling, or wasn't ruling, but he was living in Mount Ephraim, which was, or this is called Rehoboam of Zophah, which was placed in the vicinity of Samaria. And we know that Samaria was, at the time of Samuel here that we're reading, I don't think it had the bad thinking about it that people had, but it was just a part there of the places that Israel was living and some of them ruling from. And the meaning of this, Rathium, signifies the double Rama. It means double, the higher and the lower town. And then Zophim signifies watchman. That's what Zophim means, is watchman. And it's said that in those days they had a certain town and place that had the prophet, the schools of the watchmen. And the watchmen, of course, were ones that were supposed to be helping to watch and guard Israel. And then they had schools there. But that's what Zophah means. And so that's where Elkanah was from. And their prophets were called watchmen at times. However, the only mention of a prophet of the Lord from Moses to Samuel is in Judges. So we didn't read very much about prophets before this time either. But in Judges, and we won't turn, but Judges 6, remember there was a prophet that came and told, God sent him to tell, what's his name, Gideon, that he was going to help them with one of the battles that they had to fight. So anyway, God sent this prophet unto them at that time. After the book of Samuel, we read about prophets a lot. So Samuel was evidently known of as a prophet also. He was, because Saul would go to him for instructions. But it's possible that Samuel was from that school of prophets, was one of them from. But he says here, it just gives the meaning of, the names of all of these sons and people that Elkanah was from. It's interesting, isn't it, how God was so particular about giving all the names of the fathers and names of the sons and everything. What does that show to you about God? Yes, he is personal. He loves everyone, and he's concerned about everyone. He wants to know all about us, our family, and so on. Anyway, in verse 2, and he had 2 wives. The name of the one, this is Elkanah, had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now, in the first place, was it God's order for him to have 2 wives? No. That was, we read a lot in the scriptures in the Old Testament where a lot of the men had more than 1 wives. But that was not God's order, and that would always bring problems sometime. Thank you, Betty.
And let there be light.
So, right to start off, we can see that there's problems in this family. And then, for one of them to have children and the other one not to, what was so bad about the one that didn't have children? I don't mean bad about the woman, but why?
This
Why
is
was that
sin.
a reproach? It was seen as a reproach, yes. And some even thought of it as God not being pleased with it. But notice here it says, well, we'll read it in a little bit, that the Lord was the one that caused her not to have children. So notice in verse 3, and the man, Elkanah, went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the two sons of Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. And when the time was for Elkanah offered, he gave to the priests, gave to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah. But the Lord had shut up her womb. So that's where we see that her being barren, not being able to have children, was of the Lord. The Lord did that. Even though it seemed to most people as that was not the Lord's blessing, but it was the Lord that did that. But let's go ahead and read it a little bit. He had given unto Hannah more than he gave to Peninnah. What it was in those days when they would bring offerings to the Lord, especially with the peace offerings, and this is what we're talking about here. They brought an animal to be slain for an offering to the Lord. That's how they worshiped the Lord. And with the peace offerings, they would bring that offering, and they would put a portion of the meat that from the animal would be burned unto the Lord. But then part of it, a big part of the animal, would be given to the one that brought it, and he and his sometimes friends, but always his family, they would sit around and have a meal with that food, that meat. So remember Joseph when Joseph's brothers came and he had all of them stay for a meal, and what did he do with Benjamin?
He gave him larger, more than the rest.
He gave him a lot more than the rest. That was just kind of like it was here. I think probably that was a carryover from, this is a carryover from giving someone that they really thought a lot of or wanted to do real well by. They would give them more of a portion. Not very wise. Having problems with their electricity.
Fuses.
Anyway, those of you that are online, you'll have to put up with us as we go through these times of being dark. Anyway, going back to our story here, Elkanah gave Hannah, when they would bring an offering, they did this once a year, every year, and they would take it to Shiloh because God had ordained that place for them to take their offerings and worship the Lord. He told them to come to this certain place, which they did, and once a year. This shows us that Elkanah's family was a very spiritual family. They loved the Lord and they obeyed the Lord. And so they would take this offering every year. And then they would sit around and eat part of it all together. It was a good time of fellowship and worship. Reminds me of our potlucks that we had. It's a time of fellowship and worshiping the Lord. This is was the same thing here. They would go to Shiloh for that. So that shows that they were a religious family. I'm going to say a spiritual family. And would enjoy the Lord and each other in that way. But for of Elkanah to give Hannah more than give the rest, and more than Hannah, his first wife, or the wife that had all the children, was not very wise with Elkanah, because that would cause jealousy, and it did. In verse 6, it says, and her adversary, Hannah was an adversary of Hannah because Hannah didn't have children. Hannah was mocking her and getting on to her, just being very bad towards her because she wasn't having children. And you know, like I said, sometimes they thought that was of the Lord that they did because their life was miserable.
That's right.
Because their life, they thought that their life wasn't spiritual. So the Lord would give up.
If they wouldn't get pregnant.
Yes. And so they thought that was the Lord's judgment, not letting them get pregnant because of that. No, that wasn't true, because we read the Lord had shut up her womb so she couldn't bear children. But Hannah was kept mocking and getting on to Hannah. The reason that we say that is because Hannah realized that Elkanah loved Hannah more than he did Elkanah, more than he loved Hannah. Elkanah loved Hannah, he get this straight, more than he did Hannah. And so Hannah to be jealous. So her jealousy caused her to be upset with Hannah. I remember one of these paragraphs here before I wrote. And interesting, it just shows what, when something's out of order, the problem's extreme. Let's see if I see this. Verses 6 and 7. It says, this was a sad situation. We can see problems with all involved. Although it seemed to be the accepted custom at that time to have more than one wife, that was not God's ordained order. There would always be a lack of unity in such families and thus problems. When Jesus was talking about marriage to his disciples, he said, a man shall leave father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. Now that was talked about in Genesis 2:4. That's what God said. And in Matthew 19, verse 5 and 6, we see that Jesus ordered that scripture, and he was telling his disciples that they shouldn't have more than one wife. He said, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall cleave to his wife, and they two shall one flesh. How can two be one when a third one is involved? Not possible. Well, it's not possible either for them to be without problems, something, a family without harmony is a family. Yes, we have to go according to God's order. If we don't go according to God's order, there's going to be problems. And so that's why we need to seek the Lord for all that. Let the Lord guide us and do according to the Lord. Because every year Hannah would do this. She would mock Hannah and tell her that, you're just no good. You're not good enough for the Lord to let you have children, and so on. And so that would cause Hannah to be very upset. And then Elkanah didn't help matters any when he would give Hannah more of the food than when they all met together. So anyway, in let's read from verse 7. As he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, so she provoked her. This is Peninnah provoking Hannah. So she provoked her. Therefore, Hannah wept, and she got where she wouldn't eat. Maybe she'd take a few bites or something. We are all women. We can understand that. Why she would be upset, and when she's upset, she wouldn't want to eat with all the rest of them and so on. But this was a result of not going according to God's order. Then said Elkanah to Hannah, to her husband, and I'm reading from verse 8, Hannah, why weepest thou? And why eatest thou not? Why are you weeping so? And why aren't you eating anything? It says, why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to thee than 10 sons? He says, no, I love you, and I'm giving you more, and I'm good to you. Am I not better than 10 sons? Men don't always understand.
Like you used to say, they just don't get it.
But Elkanah certainly didn't understand, thinking that she knew that he loved her more, but that didn't take care of the problem that she wanted a child. And it didn't take care of the problem of Peninnah continuing to mock her and do problems for her.
Yeah. It's amazing though that Hannah went this long without praying this way.
Yeah,
I mean, it took all of that to get her to this point.
it did. But she finally got
But she
there.
did. Yeah.
The Lord knows just what to give us in our lives, and He knows how long it'll take. He doesn't stop working. He doesn't stop dealing with us and guiding us and causing us to go on.
Long suffering,
Yes.
patient.
And after she has the baby, Peninnah's never mentioned it.
Yeah.
Hannah ends up with it all.
And yet I told Rick, now you gotta understand, I don't ever want kids. And he said, that's okay, that's all right. I accidentally got pregnant.
The Lord, it wasn't accidentally. It wasn't accidentally. The Lord knew that you needed children.
We were together 5 years and married, and I said, I never want kids, I hate kids. I still do.
No, you don't. No, you don't. You request prayer for your children all the time.
Yeah, Lord, take them.
What I appreciated about this, Nellie, was the fact that when I couldn't have children, I went a long time too without praying this way. And God was patient and got me to that point to pray
Yes.
like that.
Yes. Give us your testimony.
I couldn't have children. And it was because of the chemo that I was taking. And the first thing they told me is that there will be infertility, for sure. That was a definite. And I really am the only one on record that had a child.
Oh, is that right?
Yes. And so I knew I couldn't. And I remember accepting it. Okay, let's just go with this. And I knew it was the Lord. And so we did foster children and we did this, we did
Oh,
that.
yeah, I remember that.
But then my heart started aching and longing and hurting. And I just remember hurting more and more, and it was growing, and it was just beyond my grasp. I couldn't do anything about it. And God used that. I kept seeing this little baby that would wave at me, and I wanted that baby so bad. And that's what God used to get me to pray the way Hannah did. I went out in the desert, and I prayed her prayer, Hannah's prayer. And I said, if you give me a baby, I'll raise that baby for you
Oh.
and give it back to you. I was pregnant the next month.
Wow.
So, and that's why we named her Hannah.
So the Lord answers prayer, and the Lord is concerned about us. He knew exactly when you needed that child.
Yeah.
He knew when Hannah needed to get pregnant, and He works accordingly. He wants us to be willing to trust Him, to just wait for Him, for His timing, and trust Him. But He put that desire stronger and stronger in your heart when it was time.
Yeah.
And so that's working the same way here.
It was painful.
Verse 9, so Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh. She evidently went ahead and took a few bites. And after they had drunk, yeah,
Now, Eli.
yes, I was just wondering if I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't think so. Now Eli, the priest, was upon a seat by a post in the temple of the Lord. And that's the certain place that the high priest would sit and see what was going on. And then in verse 10, and she was in bitterness of soul. This was Hannah was in bitterness of soul. They were still there in Shiloh. And she prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. Now the fact of having no razor come upon his head, not having his hair cut, is the requirement that God gave to some of the people. He says that they wanted to give their life completely to the Lord, and so they were called Nazarites. And the Nazarites couldn't shave their head, cut their hair, couldn't drink strong drink, and they had to be completely set apart unto the Lord. And this is what Hannah was saying. If you will give me a man-child, why do you think she asked for a man-child? Why not just a child?
Because she wanted to give him to the Lord.
She wanted to give him to the Lord, and it had to be a man. But the women didn't serve in the priest's office and so on. And so she wanted to give him back to the Lord. This shows, and I think it probably took a long time for her to come to the place where she was would be willing to give him back. Because just imagine that. One had begged for so long, and then be willing, and told God she was willing even before she got pregnant. She was willing to let this child go back to Shiloh is what he'd have to do, and live and the rest of his life after.
What would be about, were they 6 years old?
Well, let's go ahead and see what how it says here. Verse 12. It came to pass as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli marked her mouth. Now, when she was praying, well, it says this here. Verse 13, now Hannah, she spake in her heart. Only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunk. And Eli said unto her, how long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thine wine from thee. Now what does this tell us about Eli?
Not very smart.
Not spiritual at all. Not spiritual. He's not only not smart, but he's not a spiritual man. Or he would have known that she was crying, not drunk in this way. And when she was praying, she was moving her mouth, but she wasn't speaking out loud. She knew the Lord heard her. She was just speaking to the Lord. But Eli wasn't very spiritual. He didn't realize what was going on. This is the way that Israel as a nation was during this time. They weren't spiritual as a whole. And I know that God had his spiritual ones here and there. But as a whole, as a nation, they weren't spiritual. The priests were not spiritual. We read later, we'll see that Eli's sons that became priests after he did, or no, that were still priests. Eli was a high priest, and his sons were priests, and they were supposed to be, spiritual leaders, and yet they were very wicked also. They would just do all kinds of bad things, and we'll read about them later. But the whole system was broken down and not yielding to the Lord, not seeking the Lord. And Hannah knew this. That's why she was willing to give up her son, give up If the Lord, she thought, if you would only give me a son, I'll give him back to you, and he will be a spiritual leader. And so that was her desire. Eli thought she was drunk. Verse 15. Hannah answered and said, No, my Lord, I am a woman of a sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. This is what the Lord wants us to do. This is what Alice did with the Lord. Poured out her soul to the Lord. And we all have at times when something is really bothering us. But the Lord answers. The Lord hears that. He sees it. He might not answer right away, or he might, but he sees it. He wants us. He brings us trials so that we will get that close to him and pour out our soul to the Lord. Sorry.
Pray harder, ladies.
Yeah, join us. So anyway, she told Eli what was going on. In verse 16, count not thine hand back for a daughter who was of Satan. For out of the abundance of my complaint and this grief that I spoke in, yes, we will have grief. We will have sorrow, but we need the Lord with all of that. Verse 17, then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. The God of Israel grant thee thy petition. Now he wasn't a spiritual leader. His sons were not spiritual, and yet he had this confidence in God to say the Lord will answer your request. So, do we have to be so spiritual? Do everything just so for the Lord to hear us and answer? No. The Lord
Looks like God was answering Hannah's heart. Maybe not so much what Eli said to her. I mean,
well,
yeah, it encouraged her.
but he used Eli.
Yes,
That's what I'm saying. God will use people that are not spiritual to cause his will to be done. Anyway, verse 18, and she said, Let thy handmaid in grace find grace in thy sight. And the woman went her ways and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. So she wasn't pregnant yet, but she believed. She believed what Eli told her. She believed in God.
Oh, immediately. What is happening? Just
keep it short.
She believed that God had heard her and would answer. Verse 19, and they rose up in the morning early and worshipped before the Lord, and returned and came to their house in Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. Simply is telling us that they got together and the Lord is answering that prayer. Therefore it came to pass when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived that she bore a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, Because I have asked him of the Lord. Samuel means heard of God, something like that. Whatever she would call his name, she would know, that would remind her that God had heard her prayer and answered. And the man Elkanah and all the house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah went not up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. And Elkanah her husband said unto her, Do what seemeth good to thee. Tarry until I have weaned him. Only the Lord establish his word. So the woman abode and gave her son suck until she weaned him. So, there in, and I have it in here. Where it is, it's one part, one's, 23. Well, it's the Maccabees, I think, is that someone that has written about the things, yes.
After verse 21, 23, you say from second Maccabees, 7:27.
Yes, that's it. From second Maccabees 7:27. It has been inferred that the time of weaning included the periods of nourishment and the bringing up of the child, which would bring Samuel to the age of at least 12 years. However, others believe, and this is what the different things I read, most others don't accept that, but they believe that he was approximately 3 years old. And in Isaiah 28:9 it says, "Whom shall he teach knowledge, and whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breast." So, in my mind, I think that this is more the age he would have been, about 3. And I knew that they would continue nursing their babies in the Bible times a lot longer than we do today. But
But then she got to go see him, right?
Once a year.
once a year, she would go see him, and she would take a little coat, or clothing that would, because he was growing, and so she would take one that would fit him the next year and take to him and see him once a year. And she would spend a couple of days there probably, maybe 3, because that's when they would take an offering and they would offer it to the Lord, and they would have their meal together and everything, and then go back. But it would be awfully hard, I believe, for her to take him at that young age, knowing what kind of people Eli and his sons were. They were wicked men. The sons were. Now, Eli wasn't so wicked, but he wasn't very spiritual. And so she knew that he wouldn't be in the best of place for him to grow up.
He wasn't even raised at that point in time. 12 years old might have been a little more understandable, but that's still practically a baby at 3 years
At
old.
3 years old, he wouldn't have known very much. The Catholic Church, he said, "Give me a child of the first 5 years, and they'll always be a Catholic." So it is amazing, I think, how much children learn in the first few years. And I've heard that being 5 years in other places, how that most of what they learn, most of their, not what they learn, but their
Character is established,
yeah,
pretty much.
is established by the age of 5.
Paul said in education from 1 to 5, the brain is set. It establishes all the patterns and everything from ages 1 to 5.
Is that right? So he was studying all about that. But it's interesting. It's like that.
Where's your clock?
Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop there now. Well, I got most of it down. But I do want to bring up some other things that the Lord put on my heart. And I know the Lord did put it on my heart. And then I did talk to Preston, Pastor, and let him know what I wanted to mention to you ladies, and so he was in agreement. But turn to 1 Corinthians 14. Let's read from verse 33. God is not not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. Now we know, and we won't take time to turn, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we're right here, so turn back a couple of pages to chapter 11. And we read from verse 2. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things, and keep the ordinances as I delivered unto you. Now, in a couple of chapters over, it says, God says, and Paul said, that the ordinances and what he was saying to them was given to him of the Lord. And so these ordinances were given first of all.